Here are 3 techniques that Puss in Boots: The Last Wish used to level up its visual style for a modern audience. When the character was first introduced in Shrek 2, he had a very different look and feel. His design needed to fit into the world that was established with the first Shrek film, which was stylized fairy tale elements with textures and effects that appeared how they would in real life, at least as close as they could in 2004. Even when the character got his own spin-off movie, the art style still trended towards photorealism with hints of expressive design. So here's what's really cool about The Last Wish. Rather than trying to go back to the visual style of the Shrek films, The Last Wish took this opportunity to update the art style for a post-Spider-Verse world, where photorealism has been replaced with stylization. There are countless ways that they updated the art style, but I think these 3 techniques that updated the animation style are some that are really worth highlighting. Because this movie has hundreds of video essays, I'm gonna try to highlight some techniques that I don't think anyone else has discussed too much, beyond just saying that the animation looks like Spider-Verse. When I talk about the animation style, I'm referring to the way that the characters move and the poses that they are hitting. This is different from the rendering of the movie, since these are entirely different departments in the feature animation pipeline. The characters from the early films move in a very fluid and natural way, but the animation isn't too exaggerated. Also, the eyes of the characters are lit as they would be in a real environment and don't necessarily pop against the rest of the character. So here's the first thing that The Last Wish does differently. They prioritize the readability of the character's pose, particularly their facial expressions. Even more specifically, the character's eyes seem to be the most important area of focus on the pose. Every character in The Last Wish has eyes that are bright against their face, so when Puss in Boots is in a dark environment, his green eyes are still emitting color. The eye materials have an emissive property. This means that the geometry emits the surface material as light, so that it can be seen even in dark environments. This technique allows more of a focus on the eye mask of the character's facial expressions. The eye mask is the area around the eye that includes the eyeballs and the eyebrows. If you've ever seen The Incredibles, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The masks that the superheroes wear is a perfect way to see this clearly. When drawing characters in 2D, a lot of attention is paid to this area of facial expressions since eyes are considered the window to the character's soul. For 3D animation, this is no exception. Each facial expression has a carefully constructed eye mask that is sculpted to best relay the thoughts and mood of the character's inner monologue. By giving characters an emissive eyeball materials, the animators can better draw the audience's attention to the shape of their eye mask, making their emotions very clear at a glance. It's a very subtle difference that isn't as obvious as making his hat bigger to give him a bolder silhouette, but I think this is worth mentioning as 2D techniques become more common in 3D animations. If you think that's cool, the next 2 things The Last Wish does are some of my favorite techniques that have also never been seen before in a DreamWorks movie. The second thing that The Last Wish is definitely one of the more noticeable techniques, but there's a secret ingredient to it that not even Spider-Verse uses. Throughout the movie, the characters move on different frame rates depending on the context of the scene. 99% of movies, animated or live action, are 24 frames per second, and this never changes during the runtime of the movie. What does change is the amount of frames that a pose is held for. If the character is changing poses every 1 frame, like in low action dialogue scenes, this is called animating on ones. If the character is changing poses every 2 frames, such as in high action fight scenes, this is called animating on 2s. If we compare this to Spider-Verse, the characters by default move on 2s, even for dialogue scenes. And for the high action scenes, they can vary between 1s and 2s, or sometimes even 3s. Like I mentioned in my full video of how Spider-Verse broke the rules of 3D animation, there is no motion blur created by the computer. It's all drawn in by action lines or smear frames. Here's what The Last Wish does differently. I've seen the claim that The Last Wish has no motion blur, and it has plenty of smear frames for action scenes, but when the characters are moving on ones, there actually is motion blur between these poses. This is because without motion blur for characters moving on ones, the characters will appear jittery or stuttering. Spider-Verse is able to get away with this because the characters are mostly moving on 2s. This explains one of the reasons why Wish looked kinda weird. You can even see this with a real camera. This clip of me talking and waving has a higher shutter speed to reduce motion blur, and it might not seem obvious, but something feels off about this. Now if I reduce the shutter speed so we can see the motion blur again, this movement feels more natural to our eyes, since this is similar to how our eyes see movement in real life. By changing up the frame rate, sometimes even in the same shot, The Last Wish takes advantage of stylized 3D animation to create some really memorable fight scenes, notably anytime Puss in Boots fights with death. I would love to break down one of these scenes in full shot by shot, so if that's something that interests you, please leave a comment and tell me to do that. Let's shift our attention now to something equally mesmerizing yet often overlooked in animation. This third technique directly relates to my time working on the DreamWorks movie before The Last Wish. I got to work with the effects team on the movie The Bad Guys, and there are some similarities to their approach to effects elements that more people should know about. Our team was inspired by The Bad Guys graphic novels to give the film a hand-drawn flair for the animation of the elements that are not the characters themselves. We utilized hand-drawn effects for things like dust, smoke, water, and explosions. Effects is a way for a film to give you more information on how the world of the story works. This also holds true for The Last Wish, where effects elements like smoke, fire, and explosions help communicate to the viewer the fact that this is still a fairy tale. It invites the viewer to imagine what it would be like if they existed in this this world. For years, the default of every 3D animated film was to have the world of the characters match one-to-one the real world. Now, especially after projects like Spider-Verse and Arcane, 2D effects elements have become more popular because it shows that the filmmakers took the extra step to understand their world better. I'd love to make a video about Arcane, especially their 2D effects, so if that sounds interesting to you, tell me to do it in the comments. You know the drill. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is a technical marvel and a great story, which at the end of the day is the most important thing in any movie. It's easy to look at movies like this and say that DreamWorks copied Spider-Verse, but the reality is that the comic book aesthetic of Spider-Verse only works for that world, and you can't just take that same aesthetic and paste it into a new movie. What Spider-Verse did was open the door for other animated films to take the extra step and consider how to use the medium of animation to flush out the world of their story. Spider-Verse exists in a comic book world, so this means that the visual style feels like a comic book. Mutant Mayhem revolves around teenagers, and therefore, we see the world through the eyes of their messy doodles. And Puss in Boots exists in a fairy tale, and therefore should feel that way when we look at this world. If you want to hear more about my time on The Bad Guys, you can check out the video I made about what I did, which is linked right below the like button. Thanks for watching.